My parents abandoned me at 14, leaving me with my grandmother, calling me a freak because of my health problems. Now they're begging me to give them my inheritance to help my brother get out of trouble. I was diagnosed with epilepsy pretty early in childhood, and it turned out to be a real challenge because my parents were emotionally and psychologically unprepared to deal with it. They started treating me like some sick child they couldn't handle. I think I was about age missing when I first noticed they treated me and my brother differently. My brother was 3 years older than me, and my parents treated him so much better than they did me, probably because he was easier to deal with. But epilepsy wasn't the end of it. At 8, I was also diagnosed with dyslexia and a severe form of ADHD. No need to say that for my parents, this was a heavy burden. But it was their choice to have kids, and they should have been ready for anything that came with it. I feel like they just assumed that since my brother was born perfectly healthy, I'd be fine too. They didn't expect anything else, and when I came along, they had no choice but to put up with me. They made that clear, and it was awful. My childhood can't be called happy or even normal like most kids, not just because of my illnesses, but because of my parents. Honestly, most of my problems were caused by them, not my conditions. The illnesses were just a small part of it. Their reactions and the way they treated me, that's what really upset me. They always treated me like an outcast in the family. I never felt like part of it, and they did everything to make me feel unwanted, like a burden. When I entered a room, conversations would stop, and everyone would freeze because of my presence. I noticed this behavior before I was even 10, and it only got worse as I grew older. My mental health was pretty fragile. I couldn't handle being treated like that, and started acting out in my teenage years. I think the hormones of puberty, combined with an unhappy childhood in a home where I was never wanted, just broke my heart, and I rebelled. I stopped trying in school and deliberately failed every subject just because I was angry at my parents for how they treated me. I became stubborn, disobedient, and downright rude to everyone. I pushed everyone away, even friends. I knew I was wrong, but I was so miserable I didn't know how else to get my parents' attention. Even then, it seemed like they didn't care. Every time they were called to school because I broke the rules or misbehaved, they'd just sigh in disappointment, but wouldn't even try to reprimand me. That drove me insane, and I hated being around them at home. I'd throw tantrums to get their attention, but they'd completely ignore me, continuing to talk among themselves. They'd say I was making a scene again, roll their eyes, and tell me to behave. That was the most I could get out of them, and it broke my heart. When I turned 14, I broke a serious school rule, deciding to go all out. I brought a pack of cigarettes to school and started smoking right in the middle of class. When the teacher demanded I stop and leave, I just flipped him off. That was the last straw because I'd already been a major troublemaker before. But I'd always avoided serious consequences since my parents told everyone I was an abnormal kid who needed special patience. After that incident, though, there was no going back. I was expelled from school, and that was the only time my parents truly got mad at me. That day, they verbally tore me apart, saying things I don't think I'll ever forget or forgive. They didn't say anything I didn't already know, but it hurt to hear them say it out loud. They said they regretted having me, and that if they'd known I'd turn out to be such a messed up kid, they would have terminated the pregnancy as soon as they found out about it. They called me a burden to the family, and said things were better when they only had one son. Now they were going to do everything to get rid of me, so I'd never bother them again. They punished me for a week, and during that time, they basically kept me locked in my room. I wasn't allowed to leave except to use the bathroom, and they brought food to my room. I wasn't allowed to go anywhere or talk to anyone, and I was absolutely miserable. I felt like a prisoner in solitary confinement, but it was worse because my own parents were doing this to me. I don't think I committed some crime. I was just acting out, and in my opinion, it was a result of their mistakes. They never gave me the attention I wanted, or rather needed. I was a kid, and they were supposed to be good parents to me. They messed everything up. I'll admit it wasn't easy dealing with me because of my conditions, but they should have been more attentive. They should have thought it through carefully before deciding to have a kid. Anyway, after a week of that treatment, I finally found out what they meant when they said I wouldn't be part of their family anymore. One day, out of the blue, my parents told me to pack all my stuff and get in the car. While I waited in the car, my brother and mom packed my things. About an hour later, everything was ready and we set off. The road was familiar, and a few minutes in, I realized we were heading to my grandmother's house, my dad's mom. I thought maybe they wanted me to stay there for a couple of weeks to cool off. I knew my grandmother was strict, but I also knew she treated me much better than my parents did. I didn't think it'd be a punishment for me. But when we got there, I realized it wasn't temporary. They were essentially leaving me with my grandmother to raise me because they didn't want me anymore. That's what they'd spent that whole week doing, convincing her to take me in. When we arrived, my parents unloaded all my stuff, left it at the door, and told me to bring it inside. They said this was my new home now, and added that they didn't want any more contact with me, especially after what I'd done. According to them, I tried my hardest to ruin their reputation, but now I'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. Standing at the door, I tried begging them not to do this because, despite everything, I still wanted a relationship with my parents. I don't even know why. Maybe because I was 14 and desperately wanted to feel like part of my family. So it was really hard to accept being dumped at my grandmother's. I was also a little worried that maybe she wouldn't be able to take care of me, and that's why it took her a week to agree. She was already elderly, over 60. I knew she loved me, but I wasn't sure if she really wanted to take me in. It felt like I was just going from being a burden to my parents to being a burden to her. I didn't want to disappoint her because even before, when I'd visit and she'd hear about my antics at home or school, she'd get really upset. But she always supported me, saying she knew I was strong and tried to convince me that my parents would change if I behaved better and believed in myself. That was another reason I didn't want to move in with her. I was afraid she'd start hating me like my parents did, and I couldn't afford to lose her too. Everything was so confusing, and I begged my parents to let me stay with them, but they said it was already decided. Right in front of me, they told my grandmother they were done, and didn't even want to hear about me anymore. Then, they added that they didn't want a freak like me living with them, because they wanted to focus on their perfectly normal son. That really stung because those were the exact words school bullies used to mock me. It's one thing when mean kids at school call you that. I'd gotten used to it and didn't take it seriously, but hearing it from my parents made me realize they were the biggest bullies in my life. In a way, they did me a huge favor by sending me to my grandmother because they never would have loved me no matter what I did. I'm sure even if I'd behaved better, they still wouldn't have cared because all they cared about was my brother. So after that, I stopped begging them and accepted that I'd live with my grandmother. I decided I'd become a better person because I deserved it, and so did she, and I wasn't going to ruin my life just because my parents didn't love me. After they left, my grandmother and I sat down to talk, and that conversation was much needed. She honestly told me that while she loved me, she wasn't entirely ready to take me in, and had serious doubts about it. She'd heard from my dad how I'd been behaving and said that at her age, it'd be hard to handle a troubled kid like me. She understood I needed help but wasn't sure if she could provide the right environment for me to grow up in. That's why it took her a week to decide. But after my dad told her he'd punished me by locking me in my room for a whole week while she was thinking it over, she decided her son wasn't the right person to raise me. She apologized to me for not stepping in sooner. Plus, she had her own worries. She was a widow and didn't have much money, so she wasn't sure if it was right to take responsibility for me. But when she learned how badly my parents treated me, she understood why I acted the way I did and said she wanted to give me a chance to do things right, unlike them. She told me to see it as an opportunity, and that's exactly what I did. I apologized to her for everything I'd done in the past, and said I forgave her for not stepping in earlier and taking me away, even though she knew how badly my parents treated me. We decided to leave it all behind and work together for a better future for me. I've always been and will always be grateful to my grandmother for everything she did because I truly believe I wouldn't be the person I am today if she hadn't been part of my life and decided to take me in. After that day, I turned my life upside down with her help. Moving in with her, I consciously tried to improve in everything I did, and she tried for me too, supporting me, helping me, and creating the environment where I could grow and succeed. She found me the right tutors to help with school, and even enrolled me in a private school where the teachers knew about my conditions and didn't treat me like just any other student. Unlike my parents, she didn't use it as an excuse but made sure I got the help I needed, and it really worked. Thanks to that, I graduated high school with good grades and got into college like any other kid. I achieved everything I wanted, and I owe it all to my grandmother. My parents would occasionally visit her, but they never saw me because I avoided them. Every time they came, I'd leave the house and only come back when I was sure they were gone. They didn't seem to care, and neither did I. That went on for a couple of years, but then my grandmother had a big fight with them over the situation. She told them they were awful people because they didn't even try to talk to me, especially after I started succeeding, which gave them a reason to apologize for what they'd done. They refused to admit they'd made mistakes raising me and kept pretending they'd been perfect parents while I was just a bad kid. They called me a rotten apple and a freak again, and my grandmother couldn't take it. She told them not to come back, and they kept their word. Their selfishness was so extreme that they couldn't accept they'd been bad parents to me, and that's one reason I ended up in such a state at 14. But thanks to my grandmother's guidance, I changed, and even that they couldn't acknowledge. After that, we didn't speak for almost 10 years. My grandmother and I pretended those people didn't exist in our lives. During that time, I achieved a lot and went through many important milestones, but I never talked to my parents, and they never tried to reach out. I had social media, I never blocked them, and they could have messaged me, but they chose not to. And now they've contacted me, and the reason is that my grandmother passed away a few months ago. I took it really hard because she was the only person who was always on my side no matter what. Even though we hadn't lived together the last few years, since I went to college and then got my own place, she was always my rock and support. Life without her feels completely different, and I was still trying to cope with her loss when I saw my parents. It hadn't even been 6 months since her death, and there they were at my doorstep, demanding I share my inheritance with them. The reason? My perfectly normal and healthy brother apparently isn't doing as well as they expected, and now they need my help to deal with the trouble he's gotten into. A few days ago, they visited me. My brother wasn't with them, which was surprising since he always used to come along. I decided to talk to them because I thought maybe they'd come to apologize. But after a couple of polite phrases and condolences, they got to the point. They told me my brother got hooked on drugs in college, and it's starting to affect his ability to work. I don't know why they tried to sugarcoat it, but it sounds like he has serious problems and needs help. Now they wanted me to share my inheritance to pay for his rehab. I asked why he couldn't just do a cheaper treatment they could afford. They said they tried, but it wasn't enough. He needs inpatient treatment, which they said is expensive. Personally, I don't know anyone who's been through rehab, and I don't know how much it costs. I'm not going to find out either. All I know is that I have my own money now. I have a good job and I'm well off, And I know my grandmother was in a pretty good financial position too, since my grandfather left her a lot of money, and she invested it wisely. That was a big stroke of luck for me, but not for my parents, who were too proud to stay in touch with her or apologize to her in her final years, even knowing they might need the money someday. That didn't concern me at all. I told them straight up that I'd help them with any amount they needed, but on one condition: they'd have to publicly admit everything they did to me, the awful way they treated me, the things they said, and how they treated my grandmother too. Plus, I wanted them to admit they need my help now and explain why they need my money so everyone could know what's been going on in our family. For years, we kept it all quiet because my grandmother didn't want drama, but now that they came to me and dared to ask for help despite how they treated us for the past 10 years, I thought it was necessary. I felt no guilt demanding this because I wanted them to publicly own up to their mistakes. When I said that, their faces dropped. They tried to negotiate and called me unfair and selfish, but I told them it was my condition: take it or leave it. I had no problem giving them the money. I didn't hold a grudge against my brother, and I didn't even hate my parents. But they had to admit their mistakes, so I could finally put it all behind me. They treated me terribly, and that's a fact. Plus, they were unkind to her, and this was her money. So if they wanted it, they'd have to own up to their actions. It was that simple. I don't get why they reacted so strangely, but when I told them, they started calling me heartless and cold, saying they never expected this from me. I told them they shouldn't have expected anything from me considering we hadn't spoken in 10 years, and now if they wanted my help, they'd have to admit their mistakes and apologize. That's it. I didn't want to hear anything else about it. They left after a lot of accusations and tears, but I didn't budge. Now they're trying to change my mind, saying my brother's in really bad shape and needs my help. But I don't get why they expect me to just do something for them when they never did anything for me. My grandmother and I were always on our own. They never tried to help us or even check in. Even when she passed, they probably wouldn't have known if I hadn't told the relatives. That's how they found out about the funeral and everything. So why should I help people who've had nothing to do with our lives for the past 10 years? Am I a bad person for telling my parents I won't help them financially unless they publicly acknowledge and own up to their mistakes? Update 1. Thanks for all the comments on my original post. I'm doing okay. Thank you so much for your concern. Losing my grandmother has been really tough, but she lived a full life, and I'm sure she left with no regrets. Thanks for the support and condolences. Now, about my parents, they're still messaging me, but I've made it clear that if they don't do what I asked, they can forget any hope of getting the inheritance. I know my grandmother left everything to me in her will, and I'm sure my parents know it too since the lawyer sent out the paperwork. Now they're just left to stew in their behavior. I'm not backing down. It's been a week since I last spoke to them, and since their begging didn't work, they've started sending me pictures of my brother. He looks really bad, his condition is pitiful, and they keep sending me these photos, saying this is the person who needs my help, and that I should step in and do something for him. My only response is, where were they when I needed their help? They abandoned me, and I was just lucky my grandmother was always there. Otherwise, I don't know where I'd be. They didn't care about me, and as sorry as I feel for my brother, I can't help them unless they apologize for what they did. And it has to be public because I want everyone to know who they really are. If they can set aside their ego for that, I might help them because, honestly, for me, it's about their pride. Their pride made them do everything they did. And now, if they really want to help the child they claim to love, they'll have to let it go. Now I'm curious what's more important to them, my brother or their pride. Update 2. It's been 10 days since I last spoke to my parents, and after a while, I just stopped replying to their messages. Today, they showed up at my place again a couple of hours ago, But this time, they brought my brother with them, and it was awful. Right at the doorstep, I told them they can't do this, and that their behavior is only making it less likely I'll help them because it makes me uncomfortable. Especially because of my brother. I can only imagine how humiliating it must be for him to be used as a pawn like this. I told them to leave, and for a while, they refused to budge, saying that if I wanted them to go, I had to promise I'd help them as soon as I could. I told them I wasn't making any promises, and if they kept harassing me, I'd call the police, which wouldn't look good for them considering my brother's condition. That scared them off, and they left, but my dad managed to say that my grandmother and I are the most selfish people on the planet. This coming from the people who dumped me on her doorstep because they didn't want to deal with a kid with special needs. They didn't want to handle me because I wasn't the perfect boy they expected. If my grandmother and I are selfish, then words haven't been invented yet to describe what they are. Update 3. It's been almost 2 months since my last update, and a lot has changed. First off, I blocked my parents, and now they have no way to contact me because I've moved to a new apartment in a different area, and they don't know my new address. During this time, I told all our relatives that no one should give my address to anyone, especially my parents. Last time, someone decided they deserved to know where I lived because their son was suffering and gave them my address. That's how they got in touch. But now I've made sure that won't happen again. After our last conversation when my dad called me selfish, I decided to block them because, honestly, I don't want this drama anymore. They've shown me that their pride will always come first. It's more important than anything else in their lives, even the son they claim to love. I can accept that they never loved me or wanted me because of my dyslexia, ADHD, and other issues, but they always called my brother perfect. So why couldn't they make one small sacrifice for him? I don't get it. All they had to do was admit they were wrong. It would have been easy because, despite our efforts to keep it quiet, most relatives already knew about the bad blood between us. So they wouldn't have had to confess anything people didn't already know. But even then, they refused to apologize because in their minds, they never did anything wrong and were perfect. Well, they can keep their beliefs, and I'll keep the inheritance. Fair's fair.